this colored sun, that, whatever the cause of the phenomenon, it was not a reflection of our sun, but a planet of some sort, a reality. Jansen, on page 394, says today another noteworthy thing happened, which was that about midday we saw the sun, or to be more correct, an image of the sun, for it was only a mirage. A peculiar impression was produced by the sight of that glowing fire lit just above the outermost edge of the eyes. According to the enthusiastic descriptions given by many Arctic travelers of the first appearance of this god of life after the long winter night, the impression ought to be one of jubilant excitement, but it was not so in my case. We had not expected to see it for some days yet, so that my feeling was rather one of pain, of disappointment, that we must have drifted farther south than we thought. So it was with pleasure I soon discovered that it could not be the sun itself. The mirage was at first a flattened out, glowing red streak of fire on the horizon. Later there were two streaks, the one above the other, with a dark space between, and from the main top I could see 4, or even 5, such horizontal lines directly over one another, all of equal length, as if one could only imagine a square dull red sun, with horizontal dark streaks across it. One day soon after this, I felt exceedingly drowsy, and fell into a sound sleep. But it seemed that I was almost immediately aroused by my father's vigorous shaking of me by the shoulder and saying, "Olaf, awaken, there is land in sight." I sprang to my feet, and oh, joy unspeakable! There, far in the distance, yet directly in our path, were lands jutting boldly into the sea. The shoreline stretched far away to the right of us, as far as the eye could see, and all along the sandy beach were waves breaking into choppy foam, receding, then going forward again, ever chanting in monotonous thunder tones the song of the deep. The banks were covered with trees and vegetation. I cannot express my feeling of exultation at this discovery. My father stood motionless, with his hand on the tiller, looking straight ahead, pouring out his heart in thankful prayer and thanksgiving to the gods Odin and Thor. In the meantime, a net which we found in the stowage had been cast, and we caught a few fish that materially added to our dwindling stock of provisions. The compass, which we had fastened back in its place, in fear of another storm, was still pointing due north, and moving on its pivot, just as it had in Stockholm. The dipping of the needle had ceased. What could this mean? Then too, our many days of sailing had certainly carried us far past the North Pole. And yet the needle continued to point north. We were sorely perplexed, for surely our direction was now south. Peary's first voyage, pages 69 and 70, says on reaching Sir Byam Martin's Island, the nearest to Melville Island, the latitude of the place of observation was 75 degrees 09-23, and the longitude 103 degrees 44'-37. The dip of the magnetic needle of 88 degrees 25'-58" west in the longitude of 91 degrees 48, where the last observations on the shore had been made, to 165 degrees 50'-09". Cast, at their present station, so that we had, says Peary, in sailing over the space included between these two meridians, crossed immediately northward of the magnetic pole, and had undoubtedly passed over one of those spots upon the globe, where the needle would have been found to vary 180 degrees, or in other words, where the North Pole would have pointed to south. We sailed for 3 days along the shoreline, then came to the mouth of Fjord or river of immense size. It seemed more like a great bay, and into this we turned our fishing craft, the direction being slightly northeast of south. By the assistance of a fretful wind, that came to our aid about 12 hours out of every 24, we continued to make our way inland, into what afterward proved to be a mighty river, and which we learned, was called by the inhabitants Hiddekel. We continued our journey for 10 days thereafter, and found we had fortunately attained a distance inland where ocean tides no longer affected the water, which had become fresh. The discovery came none too soon, for our remaining cask of water was well nigh exhausted. We lost no time in replenishing our casks, and continued to sail farther up the river, when the wind was favorable. Along the banks great forests miles in extent, could be seen stretching away on the shoreline. The trees were of enormous size. We landed after anchoring near a sandy beach, and waded ashore, and were rewarded by finding a quantity of nuts that were very palatable, and satisfying to hunger, and a welcome change from the monotony of our stock of provisions. It was about the 1st September, over 5 months, we calculated, since our leave-taking from Stockholm. Suddenly we were frightened almost out of our wits by hearing in the far distance the singing of people. Very soon thereafter we discovered a huge ship gliding down the river directly toward us. Those aboard were singing in one mighty chorus that, echoing from bank to bank, sounded like 1,000 voices, filling the whole universe with quivering melody. The accompaniment was played on stringed instruments not unlike our harps. It was a larger ship than any we had ever seen, and was differently constructed. Asiatic Mythology, page 240, Paradise Found, from translation by Sayce. In a book called Records of the Past, we were told of a dwelling which the gods created for the first human beings, a dwelling in which they become great, and increased in numbers, and the location of which is described in words exactly corresponding to those of Iranian, Indian, Chinese, Iraic and Aztecan literature, namely, in the center of the earth, Warren. At this particular time our sloop was becalmed, and not far from the shore. The bank of the river, covered with mammoth trees, rose up several hundred feet in beautiful fashion. We seemed to be on the edge of some primeval forest, that doubtless stretched far inland. The immense craft paused, and almost immediately a boat was lowered, and 6 men of gigantic stature rowed to our little fishing sloop. They spoke to us in a strange language. We knew from their manner, however, that they were not unfriendly. They talked a great deal among themselves, and one of them laughed immoderately, as though in finding us a queer discovery had been made. One of them spied our compass, and it seemed to interest them more than any other part of our sloop. Finally, the leader motioned, as if to ask, whether we were willing to leave our craft, to go on board their ship. "What say you, my son?" asked my father. "They cannot do any more than kill us." "They seem to be kindly disposed," I replied, "although what terrible giants! They must be the select 6 of the kingdom's crack regiment. Just look at their great size." "We may as well go willingly as be taken by force," said my father, smiling, "for they are certainly able to capture us." Thereupon he made known, by signs, that we were ready to accompany them. Within a few minutes we were on board the ship, and half an hour later our little fishing craft had been lifted bodily out of the water by a strange sort of hook and tackle, and set on board as a curiosity. There were several hundred people on board this, to us, mammoth ship, which we discovered, was called then as, meaning, as we afterward learned, pleasure, or to give a more proper interpretation, pleasure excursion ship. If my father and I were curiously observed by the ship's occupants, this strange race of giants offered us an equal amount of wonderment. There was not a single man aboard who would not have measured fully 12 feet in height. They all wore full beards, not particularly long, but seemingly short-cropped. They had mild and beautiful faces, exceedingly fair, with ruddy complexions. The hair and beard of some were black, others sandy, and still others yellow. The captain, as we designated the dignitary in command of the great vessel, was fully a head taller than any of his companions. The women averaged from 10 to 11 feet in height. Their features were especially regular and refined, while their complexion was of a most delicate tint heightened by a healthful glow. According to all procurable data, that spot at the era of man's appearance upon the stage, was in the now lost Miocene continent, which then surrounded the Arctic pole. That in their true, original Eden some of the early generations of men attained to a stature and longevity unequaled in any countries, known to post-Diluvian history is by no means scientifically incredible. W.M.F. Warren, Paradise Found, p. 284. Both men and women seem to possess that particular case of manner which we deem a sign of good breeding, and, notwithstanding their huge statures, there was nothing about them suggesting awkwardness. As I was a lad in only my 19th year, I was doubtless looked upon as a true Tom Thumb. My father's 6 feet 3 did not lift the top of his head above the waistline of these people. Each one seemed to vie with the others in extending courtesies, and showing kindness to us, but all laughed hearty, I remember, when they had to improvise chairs for my father and myself to sit at table. They were richly attired in a costume peculiar to themselves, and very attractive. The men were clothed in handsomely embroidered tunics of silk and satin, and belted at the waist. They wore knee breeches and stockings of a fine texture, while their feet were encased in sandals adorned with gold buckles. We early discovered that gold was one of the most common metals known, and that it was used extensively in decoration. Strange as it may seem, neither my father nor myself felt the least bit of solicitude for our safety. "We have come into our own," my father said to me. This is the fulfillment of the tradition told me by my father and my father's father, and still back for many generations of our race. This is, assuredly, the land beyond the north wind. We seemed to make such an impression on the party, that we were given specially into the charge of one of the men, Jules Gaultier, and his wife, for the purpose of being educated in their language, and we, on our part, were just as eager to learn as they were to instruct. At the captain's command, the vessel was swung cleverly about, and began retracing its course up the river. The machinery, while noiseless, was very powerful. The bank sentries on either side seemed to rush by. The ship's speed, at times, surpassed that of any railroad train on which I have ever ridden, even here in America. It was wonderful. In the meantime we had lost sight of the sun's rays, but we found a radiance within emanating from the dull red sun which had already attracted our attention, now giving out a white light seemingly from a cloud bank far away in front of us. It dispensed a greater light, I should say, than 2 full moons on the clearest night. In 12 hours this cloud of whiteness would pass out of sight as if eclipsed, and the 12 hours following corresponded with our night. We early learned that these strange people were worshippers of this great cloud of night. It was the Smokey God of the inner world. The ship was equipped with a mode of illumination which I now presume was electricity, but neither my father nor myself were sufficiently skilled in mechanics to understand whence came the power to operate the ship, or to maintain the soft beautiful lights that answer the same purpose of our present methods of lighting the streets of our cities, our houses and places of business. It must be remembered, the time of which, right was the autumn of 1829, and where the outside surface of the earth knew nothing then, so to speak, of electricity. The electrically surcharged condition of the air was a constant vitalizer. I never felt better in my life than during the 2 years my father and I sojourned on the inside of the earth. To resume my narrative of events, the ship on which we were sailing came to a stop 2 days after we had been taken on board. My father said as nearly as he could judge, we were directly under Stockholm or London. The city we had reached was called Jehu, signifying a seaport town. The houses were large and beautifully constructed, and quite uniform in appearance, yet without sameness. The principal occupation of the people appeared to be agriculture. The hillsides were covered with vineyards, while the valleys were devoted to the growing of grain. I never saw such a display of gold. It was everywhere. The door casings were inlaid, and the tables were veneered with sheetings of gold. Domes of the public buildings were of gold. It was used most generously in the finishings of the great temples of music. Vegetation grew in lavish exuberance, and fruit of all kinds possessed the most delicate flavor. Clusters of grapes 4 and 5 feet in length, each grape as large as an orange, and apples large